This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
The Super Bowl is coming up, and so today we're talking about the most important part of sports: gambling. In 2018, the Supreme Court struck down a federal ban on sports betting that spurred 4 years of nonstop ads enticing me and you and everyone I know to spend all of our discretionary income on FanDuel or DraftKings. At the time, advocates believed that the revenue streams that could come from sports betting were too good to pass up. After the Great Recession, states were cash-strapped and hungry for new sources of money. States have unevenly legalized, meaning in some places you can log onto your phone and place a bet, but in others you might still need to go to a physical location. The court left open other pathways for the federal government to curb or ban sports betting. And as many of the negative impacts of gambling have metastasized, more policymakers are questioning whether legalization is worth the revenue. My name is Jerusalem Demsis. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic, and this is Good on Paper, a policy show that questions what we really know about popular narratives. My guest today is Danny Funt, a journalist who has tracked the rise of sports betting for The Washington Post and is now working on a wide-ranging book on the topic. Danny, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I have actually never bet on sports. I grew up in a Christian household, and I am a Christian. It's just not a thing that my parents were ever allowed. We couldn't even make dollar bets at home. It was just not allowed. And I feel like I knew later on that I had kind of an addictive personality. So I was like, I'm not going to do this. I'm just never going to get into betting or gambling. Have you bet on sports? Is this something that you do?
Oh yeah. So I'm trying to be more honest about that. I used to be well, if you were a restaurant reporter, you'd have to eat out. You'd sort of be obligated to see what the culinary scene is like. So I do the same with sports betting. But truthfully, I was betting on sports long before I ever wrote about it. I will say that the more you learn about how significant the house's upper hand is, it definitely gets in the back of your head. And I do a lot less now, just knowing I don't stand a chance.
How significant is it?
It depends on what you're betting. I mean, the standard is actually pretty low. They'll win $5 for every $100 you bet.
Okay.
But nowadays, that's getting jacked up. So you might have heard of things like parlays.
Mm-hmm.
So the parlay hold percentage, which is the house revenue, the house edge, it can be as high as 20%. So
wow,
you're getting beat pretty bad if you bet a lot of parlays.
So sports betting, I feel like I really did not hear a lot about, other than just the World Cup is on and your friend might bet you $20 about the outcome or something like that. And then now I feel like it's everywhere. I feel like I'm seeing ads everywhere. I feel like every time I look over on the metro, there's some 17-year-old guy on DraftKings, something like that. Well, let's hope he's 19, not right. 17. But it feels like it came out of nowhere. And what happened?
It really did. That's really what got my attention. Was it just felt like overnight this went from something that we had all been taught was this existential threat to sports that the professional leagues and the NCAA would never support. There were basically a century's worth of scandals involving gambling that motivated that concern. And then suddenly there was a Supreme Court decision in 2018 that struck down a federal ban on bookmaking outside of Nevada.
Mm-hmm.
And that really was a starting gun for all of these states to say, hey, this is a way we can raise money and cash in on this opportunity. And it was incredible how night and day it was, where what I described as this existential evil was suddenly repackaged as this wholesome way of enjoying sports that every sports fan ought to consider.
So take us back to 1992, where that federal ban was enacted. It's called the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. What led to that effort? Who was pushing for it, and why did they think it was necessary?
Yeah, I was surprised to learn that it was the professional sports leagues, mainly the NFL, that went to Congress and said, hey, we need this. So a lot of states back then were facing severe budget deficits. It's the tail end of the Reagan era. There's a lot of resistance to tax hikes. And naturally, when you need to raise money, but you don't want to raise taxes, states will look at gambling. And there was a sort of a groundswell of loosening the laws around tribal casinos and state lotteries. And a lot of states began looking at basically a version of state-sanctioned sports betting, where a
Hmm.
state lottery is giving people the chance to wager on sporting events. And these sports leagues said, we hate this idea. We've allowed it in Nevada because it's been there forever, but
Hmm.
we don't want this to be the way that our fans engage with our product.
Why? Why were they opposed?
For one, even the 1919 Chicago White Sox scandal, where famously the team rigged the World Series so
Yeah.
that in cahoots with gamblers, that is front and center still. Pete Rose had just been banned for life for betting on baseball as a player and as a coach. Really, every decade, if you look back in the history books, there's a major scandal involving college sports or professional sports or whatever. Beyond that, they just thought, we like the idea of fans liking the games for the game's sake. And if they're looking at it through this cynical gambling lens, it'll kind of cheapen their relationship with sports and diminish our product. And
That's like very altruistic, right? Like, I mean, I don't know. Like, I would imagine these sports leagues are just like, what can make us money? You know what I mean?
definitely. At the same time, that does make them a lot of money. Think of all the
Mm.
jerseys and pennants and other merch that people buy because they're lifelong sports fans. That is, it fuels a lot of irrational, obsessive behavior.
Mm.
And then again, so does gambling. So you can understand why it was very tempting over time for the leagues to flip flop and come around on that. But the
Mm.
Senate and the House held these really robust hearings to evaluate the threat of gambling, the benefit that state-sanctioned gambling might pose. And it was just so striking to me that they sort of laid it all out on the table in the early 90s. And then fast forward 25 years later, there was really none of that. It was just, okay, let's cash in.
So Nevada, you mentioned, has always been exempt from PASPA. What has been their experience?
So around, I'd say the 50s, when casinos were taking off in Nevada, sports betting was sort of an amenity, like kind of like an all-you-can-eat buffet. It's just one more thing to draw people in so that they go to the table games and the slot machines that really make money. So in a lot of ways, sports betting was an afterthought. And yet, many of us thought if we ever wanted to bet legally on sports, that's the place to do it. So
Hmm.
people would schedule, March Madness trips to bet on college basketball, or they'd go during the Super Bowl to bet on that. So it was a pretty big draw, but it was also very marginal in terms of the bottom line for Nevada gambling operators.
Hmm.
But, gambling on sports still existed well beyond Nevada in the US because there's this thriving black market. And one of the big arguments for legalization, just like with cannabis, was people are going to find a way to do it. Let's bring it above board, tax it, implement consumer protections. And at least that was, a pretty convincing argument in favor.
You mentioned the Supreme Court decision, and this is Phil Murphy versus NCAA. That's the Supreme Court decision that basically strikes down this federal ban. What was the legal argument at issue there? Why did the Supreme Court find that, the federal government cannot ban sports betting?
So crucially, they very explicitly said they can ban sports betting. They had
Hmm.
just gone about doing it with a defective bill. So, naturally, Supreme Court decisions tend to get oversimplified in the public conscience.
Hmm.
But this one is so crucial because sports betting's advocates took the decision and said, aha, the Supreme Court has given the green light for sports betting or okayed sports betting. Really, the case turned on a fairly obscure 10th Amendment concept about states' rights. And sports betting was the focus, but it was also kind of beside the point. So New Jersey said, what the federal government has done, in essence, is said, we want to ban sports betting, but we don't want to regulate it. So we're going to commandeer the states to do the federal government's bidding. If they had legalized sports betting before 1992, that's grandfathered in. It can remain on the books. If they hadn't, they're prohibited from changing their mind and legalizing it. So this argument before the court wasn't, should the federal government be allowed to ban sports betting? It was, should they be able to tell the states that if they have an existing law, they can't change it? And it was, it sounds like the most thrilling Supreme Court oral argument. It was actually pretty dry because it's so, obscure in that way. But yeah, the effect was to overturn this ban that had been on the books for a quarter century.
What was the state interest in legalization, right? This is Murphy v. NCAA. That's Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey, a Democrat. Why was he so hell-bent on taking this on?
The funny thing is it was really Chris Christie, his predecessor, who was hell-bent on taking it on, and it really annoys Christie, who views bringing sports betting to New Jersey as one of his crowning achievements. It pains him to this day that the title of that case was updated to reflect Murphy because he took office before the decision came out. But yeah, they had this longstanding economy mainly in Atlantic City that was really struggling. They looked at Nevada and were quite envious that sports betting brings people to the state, around these major sporting events year after year. And they said this would be a way to revitalize Atlantic City. So the argument they brought to the court wasn't, let's have online sports betting across the country. It was, let's have in-person sports betting in these casinos in Atlantic City to jumpstart this ailing economy. As you could imagine, after that, all these states said, hey, we also could use a lot of tax revenue and jumpstart our economies, especially during COVID when so many states were facing pretty dire budget deficits. They said this is a fairly easy way to snap our fingers and have access to this influx of cash. And that tends to happen a lot with gambling is you're facing some sort of economic or state budgetary issue, and this is a quick fix. So once New Jersey did it and Delaware and Pennsylvania and a number of other early adopters, there was this ripple effect where states look to their neighbors and say, hey, they're making money off this. We feel like chumps because we're not. Let's get on board. And the bandwagon really got off and running.
So one thing that's interesting is that, I'm confused why there's been just such a big focus or like why sports betting has been so central to this story when it feels like all types of online gambling are legal in lots of places now. So can you help me understand like why that's been so front and center?
I mean, there's so many video games or phone-based apps where it's like, hey, do you want to, buy some tokens with real money, and then you're playing with tokens, and then you convert the tokens back to real money. So it's very sly. There's this whole phenomenon of what are branded as sweepstakes, where it's essentially a loophole to allow people of all ages to risk money on sports, but it's not called gambling. And you might remember there's a long history of things sort of finding loopholes to offer gambling by a different name, most notably the whole daily fantasy sports boom that paved the way for sports betting. So you're right. It is part of a wider phenomenon. It's interesting that true online casino gambling, like slots and roulette and poker, was predicted to follow from legal sports gambling. That was what a lot of these companies were banking on. And although about a half dozen states have legalized it, it hasn't caught on quite as quickly as some of their investors' hopes, and we could get into that.
Yeah, why not?
The main reason is that the brick and mortar casinos think it'll cannibalize their business, that if people can bet on those games on their phones, they're not going to bother to make the trek to a retail casino to do the same thing. So I still think that's going to be in the headlines a lot in the coming years as states just look for more ways to bring in tax revenue. But to your question about why sports betting seems so dominant, part of it is just the advertising is unbelievable. I mean, these companies are spending billions of dollars every year to get it in front of potential customers in as many ways as possible. As you were saying, you see it on the train. Same here in North Carolina, billboards, signs downtown. Everywhere you look, there's an appeal to get you to start betting on sports, not to mention all the TV ads. So The marketing is just overwhelming. And then beyond that, it just is startling in that this was seen as something that was done in the shadows, and now it's so mainstream and really being rammed down people's throats in a way that a lot of people are quite concerned about.
So, what is the landscape now, right? Like after Murphy, states had to pass their own legalization schemes. Right now, DC and 27 states allow online sports gambling. And, there's some regional concentration here that I thought was interesting, like basically the entire Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, as well as the Midwest. But like lots of the South hasn't, like the Pacific Northwest hasn't, like California and Texas haven't. Like, what kind of explains this regional variation?
I think in the Northeast, state lotteries are so deeply rooted. Like Massachusetts, for example, has the highest grossing state lottery per capita. So I think it was easier to transition people into a new form of gambling. In a lot of parts of the country, like California and Texas, tribal interests are so powerful. They're resisting anything that would threaten their business. In parts of the South, there's a strong conservative Christian aversion to gambling still, although I think that's dissipated a lot from one of the main reasons why the country didn't adopt more gambling sooner. So yeah, it's a lot of cultural and political reasons.
One story of yours really kind of shows how haphazard the legalization process has been. Can you tell us about the Abu Nai gambler in DC?
Yes. So as you mentioned, DC is one of the places that legalized sports betting. Um, like many places, they did it quite hurriedly and sort of making things up as they go. And one interesting decision the DC government made was to have a city-sponsored sports betting operation as opposed to letting these companies like FanDuel and DraftKings run the show. So you could bet through those companies at stadiums and arenas, but if you were out and about on your phone or at a lot of these betting terminals and cafes and restaurants and bars, you were betting with a city-sponsored sports book called Gambit. And these terminals, they sort of look like ATM machines. They popped up all over the place, including at this tiny poke shop called Abunai. And one of the interesting things about betting terminals that professional gamblers were quick to pick up on is, unlike if you're going to a brick and mortar sports book where you give your ID and they pay close attention to who it is betting, you bet anonymously through these terminals. So if you've sort of cracked the code and figured out an edge, you can bet anonymously, basically limitlessly, through these terminals and make a killing. And this one guy found deficiencies in the odds in this poorly run city-sponsored sports book. It's kind of incredible how bad the odds were compared to the rest of the market. Like, it didn't take a genius to pick off vulnerable games to bet on. So he just finds a list of places in the city that have these betting terminals. Abunai was the first alphabetically on the list. So he says, okay, great. They have a nice owner and staff who didn't mind him basically turning it into his home office. And day after day, he would just dump cash in this machine and bet as much as he could. So much so that it swung the entire city's kind of betting numbers, so that like an overwhelming amount of money was being bet through this one store. He was winning so much that the entire city-run sportsbook was net negative for an entire month.
Oh my God.
Which is unheard of. I mean, we all know the house always wins.
Yeah.
DC's sportsbook was run so poorly, the house lost in a month.
How does that happen? Like, what is going on there?
So basically, these are sports betting odds are often like efficient markets. So just like it's really hard to beat the stock market, it's really hard to beat who's going to win, a football game or a basketball game over the long haul, because basically the world's collective wisdom is informing the spreads and the odds on these games. But the people who are running Gambit, this DC sports book, were very slow to update the odds. Sometimes they would just have errors in how they input the information. So they just clearly have, the equivalent of a typo in inputting the odds. Just not a lot of oversight.
Yeah.
Even though it's a pretty airtight business. You still need a lot of smart people running it and
Yeah.
automation to manage it. So this guy just picked off all these bad lines and bad odds, and statistically, he gained the upper hand because if Gambit's odds are way out of sync with the rest of the market, chances are the rest of the market's right.
So you literally just have to like look at what other what the market is telling you, what the odds are in other places, and then just like go sit down at Abunai Poke and just say like, all right, looking at my phone, what's going on DraftKings or whatever, and then just do that.
Precisely. Like he was betting on sports that he didn't follow at all. He had no, expert insights into them. It was just a respected sports book has the odds at this number. Gambits are off in this way. I'm gonna err on the side of the respected sports book and bet against Gambit, and it was hugely profitable, at least as long as he got away with it.
Do you know how much money he made?
Yes. So thanks to some public records that were turned over, just only over the course of 3 months, he profited more than $400,000. Pretty unheard of, even for an incredibly successful bettor. That rate of return is just remarkable.
Wow. So I went down a rabbit hole when I was researching for this episode about kind of American history on sports gambling. And I did not know the role of Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, the OG Bobby Kennedy, his crusade against sports gambling. And learning that, like, kind of in the middle of the 20th century, you touch on this a little bit, but like that the real focus on outlawing sports gambling was about combating organized crime syndicates. Bobby Kennedy wrote an article in The Atlantic in April 1962 about this issue, and just quoting from it. As I sit down today to write this article, a business executive with an industrial firm on the eastern seaboard is telephoning a bookmaker to place a $50 bet on a horse race. A factory worker in a Midwestern town is standing at a lunch counter, filling out a basketball parlay card on which he will wager $2. A housewife in a West Coast suburb is handing a dime to a policy writer who operates a newsstand as a front near the supermarket where she shops. These people, and millions like them who follow similar routines every day, see nothing wrong in what they are doing. Many of them can afford the luxury of this type of gambling. They look upon it simply as taking a chance. He continues, but they are taking a chance which the nation and its economy cannot afford. They are pouring dimes and dollars day by day into a vast stream of cash, which finances most illegal underworld activities. The housewife, the factory worker, and the businessman will tell you that they are against such things as narcotics, bootlegging, prostitution, gang murders, the corruption of public officials and police, and the bribery of college athletes, and yet this is where their money goes. So I did not have a sense that like this was a big part of the modern conversation around sports gambling. Is this kind of like resolved, or are we still worried about gambling kind of going to these, underworld activities?
Yeah, first of all, it's a great article you turned up. I'm excited to find it myself and read it. That was definitely one of the arguments for legalizing sports betting around 2018 after that Supreme Court decision, because a huge amount of money was being bet through offshore sports books that operated illegally online, taking tens of billions of dollars in wagers from Americans. And there was some evidence that the criminal syndicates that were operating those sports books did a bunch of other criminal activity. So just as RFK was saying, you're in effect patronizing those sorts of criminal activities. That's not always the case. Some of them were just Americans who were bookmakers in the US and got tired of getting arrested, so they went to Latin America and set up websites where they could take bets. It wasn't quite as sinister as that. But at least as the argument went, it was a real boogeyman that you're funding criminal organizations, and why not fund taxed legitimate companies by making this legal? So yes, that was definitely a significant argument. And I think as far as that kind of conscious capitalism goes, well, the sports books that operate today definitely aren't, also selling drugs and, prostitution and all those things. There definitely is some hand-wringing among people of, does gambling exploit vulnerable people? Do we know that this is making problem gambling more prevalent? And by betting safely, are you still in effect funding companies that take advantage of people? So it's not quite as potent as the argument RFK laid out, but it's definitely still relevant.
And what has the impact been on legalization? Has legalization reduced off-book gambling? Can we even really measure that?
So you're right. It's impossible to know exactly how much gambling is going on under the table. It always has been. I think some of the estimates were inflated to make the argument seem more
Mm.
convincing, but it by no means has eliminated it or even put the dent in it that a lot of the advocates for legalization promised. Um, Again, in 1992, they looked at all these different types of cause and effect things to think about. And one of them was, if you legalize an illegal activity, do you snuff out the black market or do you just grow the pool of people doing it and, in fact, actually convert some people who might not have been doing it, who are then going to look to the black market for a variety of reasons?
Mm.
So when it comes to sports betting, yes, there are definitely those offshore illegal sports books that are hurting because of this. But there are also people who took up sports betting because they saw ads everywhere and all these generous new customer offers and started legally. And then they said, hey, there's a bunch of different reasons why betting illegally might be advantageous. Maybe I don't want it showing up on my bank statement. Maybe
Mm.
I don't want my winnings taxed. Maybe I want to be able to bet much more illegally than you're able to do so legally if I'm a winning
Mhm.
bettor. So yeah, in some respects, it's put the offshore business on the ropes, and in other respects, it's sort of created a funnel of new customers for them.
After the break, what's gained and what's lost in states where online sports betting is legal?
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
I want to delve into the welfare harms on people who are engaging in sports gambling. But before I do that, I mean, this, I think, because of your articles and a lot of other arguments being made and research coming out, there's a growing narrative about the potential mistake that this was in legalizing gambling. But I think that can be helpful to go back and think in the minds of states who were interested in legalizing gambling. What was going on with them? Like, how much money are they actually making off of this, and what sorts of things is it going to?
Yeah, that was definitely the number one argument was, hey, let's just bring in more revenue without taxing people. Always a strong selling point for at least some people. So the whether tax revenue has exceeded or failed to meet expectations varies state by state. In total, since that Supreme Court decision and all these states started legalizing, a little more than $7 billion has been raised in taxes from sports betting for state governments. It's important to note that 2.6 billion of that has gone to New York State alone, the largest legal sports betting state, which also has the largest tax rate. So they're just getting an epic windfall compared to the rest of the country.
Mm.
Many states simply send the money to their general fund. Some states, like Colorado, specifically earmarked it, in Colorado's case, for water conservation issues.
Mm.
But, tax revenue is definitely a worthwhile thing to look at, but it's not the whole picture. I think it's appropriate to look at a more holistic view of, sure, states are generating this money, but it's not like loose change they're finding in their couch cushions. This is coming
Mm.
from somewhere. It's coming from their constituents. We know gambling is in many respects kind of a regressive tax in that it, pulls money from a lot of vulnerable people as opposed to a more progressive tax that proportionately takes from people who can afford to lose. And that's why some states like Washington State have been much more restrictive in the way that, yes, they've legalized sports betting, but you can only do it on the grounds at tribal reservations. So their idea was, let's give a boost to tribal economies but we don't want to depend on revenue from gambling to fund our state's growing needs. We'd rather do that through progressive taxes, more sustainable, healthier for our society, something that definitely not all states have taken into account.
So I have seen a lot of that research around like kind of the regressivity of these sorts of tax revenues, but I was surprised with sports betting. And there was a Pew poll looking at kind of the demographics of people who engage in sports betting, and they don't really find any significant differences in educational attainment or household income. They see that men are more likely than women to have been to say they have bet on sports, and adults under the age of 50 when compared to those over 50. And Black Americans and Hispanic adults are more likely than white and Asian American adults. But I'm surprised that there's not more of a difference in household income here.
You're right. In some respects, I think sports bettors skew a little bit more middle class and well-educated compared to other forms of gambling. But when we think about the regressivity of it, or just whether it's the healthiest way for society to generate money, it's not just that the poor are the ones doing the gambling. It's also, think about that people with gambling problems are in many respects these companies' best customers. You know, they're losing such a disproportionate amount of money compared to the rest of the clientele. Are we comfortable generating money on the backs of people who are just find this ruinous for in a lot of ways beyond financially? So that I think should give people pause. But you're right. For a lot of cultural reasons, the people who bet on sports tend to be much more middle class than the people who say, do scratch offs or play the lottery.
So I want to now turn then to like all of the harms that have now become evident over the past several years. Can you walk us through the financial impacts of gambling? Like, what are we finding about the legalization of sports gambling on the impact on households' financial well-being?
Yes. So last year, I'd say two of the most buzzed about studies that came out on that topic. One of them found a direct correlation between states that had legalized sports betting and a demonstrable impact on credit scores and other measures of financial health. A similar study also last year found that household savings go down in places where sports betting is legal. So you are seeing a demonstrable impact on people's financial well-being as a result of the availability of sports betting. Part of what I find honestly quite frustrating about the way this has played out in the US is it's been treated like this experiment where we're entering an uncharted territory. We'll see how it goes. We'll discover things like, does this, hurt people financially, or does this create a public health problem that we didn't anticipate? There's a whole bunch of countries that are far ahead of the US in terms of legalizing, and there's a vast body of research that looks at the consequences. This didn't have to be this shot in the dark for the US. We could have looked at Europe and Australia and Latin America and a lot of Asia and a lot of other places that are farther along and have had to reconcile the consequences of making gambling so accessible. So in the UK, for example, where online gambling was legalized in 2005, one study recently found that Brits lose about £5.5 billion every year betting online, which results in lost economic activity of £1.3 billion. The government estimates conservatively that gambling-related health consequences cost the population more than £1 billion every year. And again, the people who did that study said, if you actually look at, the second and third degree consequences on a mental health level and, all the family trauma that it causes, it's probably much bigger than £1 billion, but we can safely say that. So yes, again, the evidence is starting to trickle out in the US, but it's been there overseas. And I think it's pretty irresponsible that the states that were establishing regulations didn't heed those warnings before getting this off and running.
Yeah. I mean, I want to underscore this. I can imagine someone going like, all right, someone's going to, buy some bad fast food out there rather than cook, or, they might gamble on some sports. These are all just consumption, and they're different levels of bad, but is it really that big of a deal? One of the studies you referenced, a Northwestern University study by Scott Baker and his co-authors, they're finding that it's not just displacing other gambling and consumption. People are falling into debt over this. So, like, for every dollar spent on betting, households are putting a dollar less into investment accounts. You're more at risk of overdrafting your bank account, maxing out credit cards. And these effects are strongest among households that are already kind of financially precarious. Charles Lehman actually wrote a great article about this for us in The Atlantic. And this is not a situation where I think it's, we're just getting money reallocated from other places. People are experiencing a lot more debt delinquency over this. The other study that you referenced, the economist Brett Hollenbeck at UCLA and his co-authors also find similarly that the increase of the risk that a household goes bankrupt by 25 to 30%. I mean, these are really big numbers that we're seeing here. And can you just walk us through this kind of gambling addiction? Is this a situation where it's a very small number of people who are getting addicted and that's what's driving these stats? Or, are there large shares of Americans experiencing financial precarity here? What do you think?
Right. So the rate of problem gambling is definitely increasing. So for a long time, it was perceived that about 1% to 2% of the population is prone to problem gambling. In states that have had legal sports betting and other legal online gambling for a while, they're seeing that rate closer to 6 or even 8%. And it's even higher among young men who are often the target audience for sports betting. But I think it's important to look beyond problem gambling. It can sort of make this seem like even though those numbers are quite alarming, it can sort of make it seem like a marginal issue. Like, as long as I'm not in that sliver of the population, I'm good. I think that those sorts of consequences that you were describing go beyond people who have diagnosable problems. So I find quite striking or even alarming the explosion of gambling among college students. And there was a survey recently that found that 1 in 5 college students who bet on sports dips into their tuition funds to fund their betting. So
Wow.
obviously, fewer than 20% of college students have gambling problems, but you're still seeing people affect themselves financially because of their betting. So it's a vast problem, and it's an under-researched area. It's also something that is a developing story, so you're not going to get a full picture out the gates. Gambling disorder, unlike some addictions where you might experience something once and become hooked on it, that can happen with gambling, but it's often a progressive disorder, so it can take several years or even longer to develop a problem. So if you think about, we're really in the early innings of this, and that sort of data and that sort of picture of how this is affecting society as a whole is still going to be emerging in the coming years.
And I mean, you talked a little about the mental health impacts of gambling addiction here, but there was a paper that came out recently that I think it's actually what spurred me to want to do this episode with you about domestic violence. Can you talk to us about what that found?
Yes, it's one of those things that's that's terrible, but honestly not totally surprising. That again, you can see a correlation between the states that have legalized sports betting and those that haven't. And when people lose bets, they're more prone to commit acts of domestic violence. There's similarly a correlation in that same respect where sports betting is legal and higher rates of binge drinking. So you can think about either fueling or just coinciding with a lot of other problematic activity. And it's why, to really take stock of what this means for society, you got to look at the bigger picture, not just some of these raw numbers that are thrown in our faces all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that most people have probably heard there's an older study that's not about sports betting, but it's just about, an NFL home team's upset loss can cause a 10% increase in the rate of at-home violence. This is the famous David Card study. And the thing that I think is really interesting about the Card doll study, right, is that like when we're talking about upset losses, right, so these are like unexpected losses, victories when the home team was predicted to win and then they lose. You would think that like, oh, well, maybe in the states where there was an upset win when the the home team was predicted to lose and they actually win, like maybe you see a decline in domestic violence, but like that doesn't happen. There's like basically like no, there's an asymmetry
Oh
here
gosh.
in the
Yeah.
gain loss utility function. So it's like you're actually just going to get more domestic violence. You're not going to like even it out or something like that. And that I think is like, it becomes like a really big problem when you are thinking about this paternalism issue here, because I can imagine people hearing this episode are just like, yeah, this sounds really bad, but like, do I think the government should be in charge of, banning something just because people are making bad decisions? The downstream effects here are what I think are really convincing. Like, no one consents to having domestic violence happen to them, obviously, ever. But that might increase as a result of someone else choosing to bet on sports seems like, even beyond the pale.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this debate often gets reduced to, should this be outlawed or should it be legal with hardly any restrictions? And I think it oversimplifies the argument, and we're really past that. I don't know how many states that have legalized are going to go ahead and say this was a mistake, let's outlaw it. But there's such a spectrum within that dichotomy of, should there be restrictions on advertising? Should there be restrictions on the enticements for customers? Should we require affordability checks to make sure people are betting at least, vaguely within their means? All these different regulations that ought to be debated instead of, should we ban this? Which, of course, you're right, is going to get a bad reaction from a lot of people who don't like the government overstepping in the decisions we make. I think consumer protections were the main argument for legalization. So whether we're living up to that promise and delivering actual protections that protect the people who were betting illegally, and now we've said this is a safer way to do things, that I hope is where the conversation goes.
It's funny. Like, I actually was surprised. I was trying to look up what people actually want to happen with legalization here. And I was shocked. Only 8% of people, there's a Pew poll about this, only 8% of people thought it was good for the country that sports betting was legal, and 34% said it was a bad thing. The rest said they thought it was neither good nor bad. I would not have expected that. Is that what you find when you're reporting, that most people are saying that they think it's bad that we're allowing this?
Yeah, I try not to put too much stock in sort of the anecdotal, even though I've interviewed so many hundreds of people in my work. I'd rather rely on, an academic who's doing a proper study.
Yeah.
That said, yeah, I find it interesting not only how many average people feel that way, but how many professional bettors who you'd think would be the biggest evangelists for legalization and defending the way they make their livelihood. A lot of them are some of the most vocal about, this has gotten out of control. It's crazy that there aren't more guardrails to protect ordinary people. I even hear plenty of people who work in the industry say states and even perhaps the federal government could be doing more to protect customers. So it's not just casual people who see all the ads and say, gee, this is run amok. It's people who are right in the middle of it who feel that way.
So you mentioned regulations or you mentioned that other countries have, had experiences with this as well. Like, are there regulations you would copy from other places that maybe can improve our situation?
Yeah, and I try not to be, a public policy advocate, but as a reporter, but I will just say things that a lot of people, whether they're health experts or player safety advocates, are encouraging to at least be debated. So one of them is countries that have banned advertisements that use expressions like free or risk-free or no sweat or bonus deceptively. So they're basically making it sound like a can't lose proposition, when either you can lose the money you're betting on the bonus, this offer, or you might get a little money through the bonus, but you're obviously going to lose money over time. Some countries have tried to weed that out. There have been a lot of countries that have restricted when and how you can advertise to try to minimize the number of young people that are seeing gambling ads day after day. So they might say you can't advertise during sporting events or during certain hours of the day when kids are more likely to be watching TV. Affordability checks are a polarizing one because that does tend to feel quite paternalistic. But a lot of the places that have imposed those, the thresholds are sky high. They're not telling you, you should spend your money here or there. They're saying, if someone's spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars within a day of signing up, maybe you ought to check in and see if they can afford to be doing that. Things that are
Yeah.
a lot more palatable than you might think when you hear a phrase like affordability check. So there's so many different reforms. Another one that is getting a lot of buzz at the federal level is this idea of a national self-exclusion list. So one thing that's quite helpful for people with problems is they say, I'd like to cut myself off from gambling to remove that temptation. But
Hmm.
currently, let's say I live in New Jersey, I can do that in New Jersey. But if I drive 15 minutes into New York or Pennsylvania, that exclusion doesn't apply in those
Yeah.
states, so it's enormously tempting to do that. It might make sense to have a national self-exclusion list, so operators that are, you know, functioning across state lines have to honor exclusion no matter where you are.
Hmm.
Things like that. Again, it's not about should we outlaw this or should we backpedal on the decision to legalize. It's there's this whole host of consumer protections that might be worth considering.
Yeah, one thing I'd heard talked about is also like, not allowing people to make bets with credit cards such that like you
Yep.
have to have the money so you can't run up these large bills and then that you literally cannot pay back. And it seems like something about allowing it, I mean, everywhere you are is a problem, right? It's there's a level to which, I mean, like, I don't know, like, I don't think we're putting the genie back in the bottle on online betting, but the idea that you can like pull out your phone at any point when you're stressed out, that you don't have to go somewhere, seems like a problem. And maybe creating some sort of like temporal bounds, like maybe you can't do it on college campuses or something like that. Like you can't do it in, schools in general, or you can't do it if at bars or something. Like, that might create some backlash here, but it indicates that like, there are ways to reduce the problem here.
You're right that you have to use geolocation when you use these apps so that they can tell that you're in a legal betting state, and it's
Hmm.
extraordinarily precise and effective. So if you're in DC and you go into a federal building, suddenly your sports betting app no longer works, right? It's literally like works by, if I'm a yard in the okay zone versus the not okay zone, it'll pick up on that. There's a state delegate in Maryland named Pam Queen, who's also a professor at Morgan State University, who had the idea of we could use this to either ban sports betting on college campuses or do something even more modest, like ban it in classrooms or in underage dorms or dorms during certain hours. The
Hmm.
possibilities, as you were saying, are limitless. And it doesn't have to be as severe as, you can't bet at a stadium or at a bar. It could be things that I think most people would agree sound appropriate, like you shouldn't bet in a freshman dorm or,
Hmm.
during class. So yeah, that is a really potent tool that um, hasn't caught on anywhere, but I think she and other people are going to be pushing for that.
I then also want to ask you about like your experiences interviewing legislators. So there are a lot of legislators who are involved in this effort, a lot of governors who have signed bills to allow sports betting or to allow online betting in their states. Have you talked to anyone who's exhibited any kind of concern with how things have gone?
Buyer's remorse in some cases.
Yeah.
Most notably, I'd say I interviewed Charlie Baker, the former governor of Massachusetts, who signed the bill legalizing bookmaking there in 2022, and then a few months later became president of the NCAA and has
Hmm.
become a really vocal champion for limiting the amount of betting on college sports, particularly in light of the brutal harassment that college athletes and coaches get whenever their performance costs someone a bet. I mean, it's honestly horrifying. The sort of stuff they
Hmm.
see on social media and in real life. And he has said point blank, I wish, in hindsight, this had stayed in Las Vegas. As you were saying, it's in pretty common sense that if you can bet from literally anywhere at any time of day, that's going to be quite a different situation than if you have to go to a casino or even go to Las Vegas in order to bet or hunt down a bookie and find ways to bet, through crypto or other
Hmm.
sort of sketchy things that a lot of people aren't comfortable doing. The idea that you can swipe to deposit money on your phone and then tap a couple of times and bet limitless amounts at any time of day is such a game changer. He was saying, we didn't really process what a difference that would make, and I wish we had. So, yes, he's maybe the most forthcoming about that, but there are a lot of lawmakers who are seeing the fallout in a lot of different respects and saying, maybe we need to re-regulate as a lot of the rest of the world has decided is appropriate.
Well, Danny, always our last and final question. This has been a episode chock full of ideas that were good on paper, but what is an idea that you had that you thought was good at the time, but ended up being only good on paper?
All right. So I was living in New York after college. I had a tiny balcony. I went and bought seeds to grow. I think it was like cucumbers and basil. And I was getting breakfast with my buddy Brian, and I was like, dude, you will not believe how cheap these seeds are. We could totally grow vegetables and herbs and whatever else and sell it, and the margins would be crazy and we'd make a killing. And he was like, so your business idea is farming? And I was like, touche, Brian, you're right. This is maybe not the most groundbreaking business idea. So he set me straight on that one.
Oh my gosh, so you didn't live out. I lived at my first house when I moved out of college was this group house, and we had the idea to like farm some vegetables for the house, and like it was successful in that like we had like some kale and sweet potatoes, but I have never in my life been like, I am never getting like my food from like my own labor. Like this is just never happening again. It's a lot of work, and I feel like it caused so much strife in our household too, because people were like, who's gonna harvest? Like, what do we do with all this like extra kale now that like no one wants to eat because we have like 20,000 bushels of kale and like you're just like giving it away. But I'm glad that you did not actually have to execute your good on paper idea. You figured it out beforehand.
Yeah, I liked it. The basil I grew, but it wasn't scalable. Brian was right.
Yeah. Danny, thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
Good on Paper is produced by Rosie Hughes. It was edited by Dave Shaw, fact-checked by Enna Alvarado, and engineered by Erica Huang. Our theme music is composed by Rob Smirsiak. Claudia Nabade is the executive producer of Atlantic Audio. Andrea Valdez is our managing editor. And hey, if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. I'm Jerusalem Demsis, and we'll see you next week.